Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion hosted by the Middle East program, Rethinking Humanitarian Aid. And we may ask ourselves, why rethink humanitarian aid? As important as humanitarian aid is, as noble as it is at its core, it does come with its own pitfalls, challenges, and blind spots. And given the criticality of addressing the suffering and destruction as a result of man-made or natural disasters, these challenges in the humanitarian aid system need to be better understood and discussed. And so we're delighted to have experts with us today on this very topic to analyze the humanitarian aid system from their research and their very rich experience. Many of which are actually Wilson Fellows, whose discussions here at the Wilson Center has brought us here today to have this discussion. Hallam Ferguson is the Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center, a former Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID from 2017 till 2021, where he managed the Middle East Bureau. Hal will be moderating today's discussion. And then we are joined by panelists Asher Orkabi, a former fellow with the Middle East program and an associate researcher at Princeton University's Trans-Regional Institute. He's also the author of the books Beyond the Arab Cold War, and most recently, What Everyone Needs to Know About Yemen. And then we are also joined by William Steiger, a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center as well, and most recently Chief of Staff at USAID. And last but not least, Jessica Alexander, who was a policy editor for the New Humanitarian, a faculty member at Columbia's School of International Public Affairs. In her career as a humanitarian aid professional, she has done a lot of research and evaluations for the UN, the Red Cross, and other NGOs. So thanks to all of you for your time this afternoon. I'm going to pass the Zoom floor to my colleague Hal to kick us off and moderate this discussion. Hal, over to you.
Thank you, Marissa. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to hand it over to our panelists in short order, but before I do that, let me just start by setting a little bit of context by citing a couple of numbers to just sort of put the problem of humanitarian aid and humanitarian need into context. So according to UNHCR, as of the end of 2020, there were about 82.4 million people displaced around the world, which is the most on record. And that is 4 times more than it was in 1995. And so this is a problem that has been increasing significantly over just the last couple of decades. Now, humanitarian assistance has kept pace largely. It is approximately 4 times the size it was in the mid-1990s. Now, to remind everyone, of course, the mid-1990s weren't exactly a great time. Bosnia was in a terrible crisis, Rwanda, Somalia. And yet we're in a place today where the people in need and the funding that's required to sustain them has quadrupled. And so that's sort of the context for what we're talking about today. But from those sort of top line numbers, it shrinks down to, beneath those numbers, there's a whole story of what has changed within the humanitarian industry and what has not. And so that's what today's panel is going to be discussing. Before I go to our first panelist, I just want to encourage everyone listening in to please send in input, comments, questions, either via Twitter or by email. By Twitter, you can tag us at Wilson Center MEP, or you can send an email to mep@wilsoncenter.org, and your questions, comments will be fed to me, the moderator. Now we'll start by going to you, Asher, who hopefully can provide us a pretty detailed case study in modern humanitarian aid. You recently published an article on Yemen specifically, focused, I'd say, largely on sort of the bad and the ugly of humanitarian aid there, albeit in the midst of responding to a pretty severe humanitarian crisis. And so after Asher, we'll zoom out into a larger context with Jessica and Bill. But first, let's turn to you, Asher. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Marissa, and thank you, Hal, for the introduction. Thank you, Marissa, for hosting. Yemen is almost how many times have you heard this massive humanitarian crisis, the largest humanitarian crisis, man-made humanitarian crisis, but yet billions of dollars every year since 2015 are dumped into Yemen. But the crisis seems to be growing worse, or at least that's what humanitarian agencies keep telling us. So while the majority of the blame can really be placed upon the Houthi government, certainly the corrupt distribution practices, this model of internationally driven humanitarian aid being deployed in Yemen is inherently flawed. And I want to take this case study from Yemen and draw four main observations, both about Yemen and then internationally driven humanitarian aid more generally. So first, between around 2015 and 2019, Yemen received upwards of $15 billion in humanitarian aid. In its highest annual total in 2018, that number reached 5.2 billion. And to put that into perspective, that's about 15% of Yemen's pre-war GDP. So overnight, humanitarian aid has become one of the country's largest economic sectors. And thus, it serves as a disincentive for peaceful resolution to the conflict, at least by those who are profiting the most from this sector. And that includes local political actors and militants, many of whom have come to serve as the default partners for large-scale humanitarian aid delivery. They derive significant profits from everything from inflated transit and distribution fees to taxes and other bribes that are given under the table. And they're also using this foreign aid as fuel for their political patronage network. So it's a very valuable commodity and not one that any of them are ready to give up on. The second point is that the increasing amounts of unchecked foreign aid has really created a very unhealthy donor dependency. And donor dependency is something that is occurring not just in Yemen, but throughout the conflicts that we'll be focusing on today and that humanitarian aid primarily focuses on, where short-term solutions are really hampering this long-term development prospects. And it's creating a cycle that one can hardly break out of. Food aid in particular, and this is the third point that I'd like to draw out, is that food aid has brought Yemeni farmers in particular into a ruinous cycle of poverty. So foreign aid imports have devastated local food production because farmers really can't compete with free or subsidized food. Crop yields in subsequent years then suffer exponentially as farmers have no profit to invest during planting season, and each subsequent year's crops are smaller and the yields certainly are a lot less. And that leads to a response from the World Food Program, which massively increases its food aid in order to make up the continuously growing differences. And that leads to a deceptively negative impact on local sustainability. The fourth point is related to medical humanitarian aid. And more generally, we're internationally driven medical programs that follow donor priorities, mostly in major diseases. And as we saw in the case with COVID-19 in Yemen and around the world, the focus on COVID-19 has inadvertently led to an overall decline in Yemen's healthcare system. And certainly we see this mirrored in other situations as well. Funding and prioritization for preventative care has declined, and the relatively small number of Yemeni medical professionals have left their local medical clinics and their primary care, and many of them are drawn by the higher paying international medical aid programs. So there's another case where addressing these short-term crises rather than the long-term needs has created a continuous public health crisis. So with all this negativity, how could one possibly solve this cycle of donor dependency and this cycle of a very negative relationship with humanitarian aid in the long term? So part of the solution might be a localization of humanitarian aid. Certainly this was the case in Yemen during the 80s and 90s, very successful local development associations. And the potential to rely maybe more on national partners has the potential to increase the efficiency of aid programs, lessen donor dependency, and most importantly, avoid the bloated and expensive bureaucracies of international NGOs that often are the majority of the cost. But that's not a magic bullet, and I think there's still two main challenges, and with this I'll end here. The two main challenges to localization are really the fact that local and even regional organizations are precisely that. There's a capacity for small scale solutions that even are able to source food aid, for instance, locally, but it's far more difficult to scale up nationally, especially when existing civil society organizations on the ground are divided by local affiliation and oftentimes tribal and religious identity. And lastly, there's an inherent danger of humanitarian aid being used to build political patronage networks. So therefore, there always needs to be that disinterested intermediary to administer the funds. Otherwise, these funds end up becoming just another way to bribe and incentivize local officials. So with that somewhat depressing note, I'll pass it back on to Hal, and we can move on with hopefully something more uplifting. Thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Asher. That's great. There's a lot to discuss there, and perhaps we can get to some of it in the Q&A. Particularly interested to hear more on localization and some of the long-term development or resilience and building sustainability of the aid as opposed to the short-term fix as you were describing it. But first, let's turn to Jessica in hopes perhaps of something a little more uplifting than Asher's sort of dire description of the situation in Yemen. But Jessica, you've had a long career in humanitarian aid and policy around the whole world. And so I'm hoping that you'll be able to pull the lens out from that one specific case and talk a little bit about kind of the macro forces at work, both in the industry and the world, what's changed, what hasn't changed. So over to you, Jessica. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. And just to start, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and to speak with and to the audience. I can't promise that what I'm going to say is necessarily going to be uplifting, so sorry about that. But I think Asher's comments do characterize a lot of the more global trends. So especially around short-termism in how we deliver aid and some of the issues and persistent challenges with locally led aid. And there's a debate about the word localization actually, and whether or not that's an appropriate word, because it sort of assumes that local actors come into the international realm as opposed to recognizing them as, separate, and that some people refer to it as locally led as opposed to localization. But what I'm going to talk to now is a bit more of a global lens of how the sector has shifted, at least in rhetorical means, over the past 2 years, and what's happened within the sector to sort of force a rethink and a real reckoning with some of the underlying structures that aid is founded on. As you mentioned, I'm an editor at the New Humanitarian, and we have a whole series on rethinking humanitarianism. So many of my thoughts and comments are coming from that series and the contributors who have written for us. But the two main events, obviously, that happened in 2020, which became this fascinating time to rethink the humanitarian sector, were, of course, the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And this wasn't the first time that the aid system had reformed or thought about reform. The humanitarian history is littered with efforts at doing so, and usually in reaction to a revealed bad practice after a major crisis. And the sector runs around scrambling to correct itself with new policies and technical fixes. And it's not therefore that the sector is resistant to change, but many argue that they go about changing the wrong things. There have been a lot of technocratic tweaks that haven't really addressed some of these underlying power imbalances that keep aid inefficient and also ineffective. And 2020 was a real inflection point, not only for the humanitarian system, but of course for the world. And it really challenged the way aid was delivered, and the operating model of Northern or Western actors parachuting in and delivering expertise or goods and stuff, but also challenging some of these false assumptions that have kept the sector back from moving ahead on issues surrounding locally led aid. And Asher talked about, the fact of, the lack of scaling up some of the locally led responses, and, a recognition that, we haven't really invested in those properly to be able to scale up in that way. And this idea that frontline or local actors don't have enough capacity, though, to meet the needs, I mean, that was really exposed as a false assumption. They stepped up, as they always do, and showed extreme solidarity with their communities. And at the same time, the Black Lives Matter movement forced this reckoning with these power imbalances and social injustice, of course. And the aid sector itself is premised on opposing this kind of injustice, and it's grappled with how these questions present in itself, racism within the sector, the colonial roots of humanitarianism, and continued colonial practices of this very Western-dominated model, and what are the implications of that. And so, it's forced a real change and a reckoning in the past year and a half. And it's raised more questions than I think we still have answers for. I already mentioned the challenges to the operating model when internationals considering new roles for themselves, coming in as intermediaries rather than doing field operations themselves. They doing things like advocacy fundraising, being a platform for enabling locally led responses. We're also shifting to we're reckoning with this response model, one that responds to chronic crisis rather than addresses the root causes of disaster. The climate crisis, of course, forced us to think about that even before the pandemic, but really after it's been accelerated. And I think one of the last things I just want to talk about, and I'll talk, maybe in the Q&A about, these are all considerations, but what has been the real outcome of these reckonings is, who we consider as vulnerable. And, at the outset of 2021, the New Humanitarian did this a panel where we asked whether the West was in crisis. This was after the Black Lives Matter protests, but the rest of the year too, with January 6th and threats to our own democratic institutions. There were a lot of questions about, what does vulnerability look like in 2020 and 2021? And, the climate crisis, of course, has exposed some of our, the West's fallibility, and really made us realize that, we are not, the infrastructure in New York City, fell apart in the last storm. And it exposed how unprepared many countries in the West are. And so, it's really raised questions about where humanitarian action starts and stops, and, has undone some of these assumptions about, aid being, this notion of strong to weak, and more about, solidarity of everyone helping each other in these times. So maybe that's a bit more optimistic, but I will pause there and can continue in the Q&A. Thanks.
So interesting, Jessica. And you stopped on, I think, a really interesting point too. There is sort of changing perspective on the West helping everybody else versus the West having its own issues, and what that means for the definition of vulnerability, et cetera. Let me turn to you, Bill. Bill, you had a senior role at USAID under the last administration, and I think we're in a position to see some pretty significant kind of macro dynamics as it in terms of humanitarian assistance, larger development aid, as well as the kind of the bureaucratic mechanics of doing something about it to improve it. So perhaps you can give us just a couple of thoughts on the more sort of USG policy perspective on this.
Thanks, El. And it's great to be with you. You're right. I had a front row seat at for the evolution of what was the transformation at USAID, which included the creation of the new Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And if I have one regret, it's that we didn't go far enough in those reforms to take on a number of the systemic questions that you've heard Asher and Jessica raise about how humanitarian assistance actually works in practice. You're right to use the word industry. I'd go farther than that and say that it's an oligopoly. What the phrase economists would use to describe humanitarian assistance is a closed market. It is composed of a relatively small number of mostly UN agencies and international NGOs, and the system itself makes it very difficult for new entrants to break into this business. And aid is delivered basically on the idea that we have to trust those who've worked with us in the past. And there is a huge aversion among donors, including USAID, to risk and to untested approaches. And it means that we give large amounts of money to organizations, whether they are the most efficient or effective providers or not. And to understand what I'm going to say about a couple of recommendations for how USAID in particular could change, I'll spend just 1 minute on explaining why the system financially is the way it is and how the market gets closed. It's important to remember that while we think that USAID, and it certainly puts itself out there as being like this, responds very quickly in the aftermath of an emergency by getting money out the door, the fact is that relatively small amounts of money actually get transferred immediately after any situation, any emergency or disaster. The bulk of the funding that aid spends on any given response can take weeks or even many months to get out the door into the accounts of any organization. And the agency relies on what are called a series of commitments to large organizations. That is essentially a promissory note in which the agency goes to a small number of organizations, asks them to take on work in a given situation, and promises to pay them back after they go through the often very lengthy process of application, review, and then disbursement of funds. And what that means, of course, is that the rich get richer. There's only a few organizations that have the cash flow to be able to take on work and spend money of their own in anticipation of US government funding flowing then soon thereafter. And it is that series of commitments, which means that local organizations are shut out because most of them can't possibly spend their own funds and then be reimbursed. They need money up front. And so this encourages the use of a small number of organizations. So what could aid do about this? Because we're never going to get away probably from using UN organizations and large NGOs in many situations. They have the capacity and the reach in many complex crises. But aid hasn't even learned some of the lessons that it should have from its own experience in, say, the Western Hemisphere in developing local disaster management agencies at the national government level who don't need our assistance anymore over a series of years with capacity building. One is that in order to bring in more organizations, USAID should expand vastly the pre-award assessments that it's doing of local groups. Now, the agency will say, we don't have the people to do that. And to a certain extent, they're right, but that's presuming they use the same model that they use today. And so what needs to change? One, more emphasis and effort needs to be put into doing more of these assessments on new groups. But two, the agency needs to switch its business practices to recognize, in a series of mutual recognition agreements perhaps, the assessments that other donors have already done. If a group has received funding from the European Union or from DFID or even from the Red Cross, it probably should be good enough to receive funds from USAID. That series of mutual recognition agreements would speed this process up a lot. And then the kind of awards that USAID should be making should be smaller and with less strings attached. There is something called a fixed amount award that USAID can use and should be using a lot more in humanitarian situations. And it should be using something called an annual program statement, which it does to a certain extent, but much more targeted on the regional level to try and both recruit and then train the kinds of organizations that Asher and Jessica would like to see that can eventually take over the actual delivery of humanitarian assistance in both chronic and urgent crises around the world. So we can get into some more details in the question and answer. Congress can play a role in helping to give AID some additional flexibilities, but most of this the agency can do by itself simply by changing some of the practices that it has invented for itself within some very, very broad legal authorities.
Thank you, Bill. Really helpful. And I really mean that. I think it's one of the things I think one learns from spending time in government is that it's easy to give sort of grand policy prescriptions from the outside, but it really does take kind of a granular understanding of the details of the mechanics, the hydraulics of the systems inside to try to make some reforms. So that's all very helpful information from you. We're already getting some questions in, and I want to again note before we go into the Q&A that if you've got a question, comments, any kind of input, You can either send it via Twitter, tagging @WilsonCenterMEP, or you can send an email into mep@wilsoncenter.org. I got a couple questions to kick us off, though. And first, I want to actually sort of pull the lens back even further, because I feel like this question is going to get to some of the assumptions that Jessica was talking about. Maybe not all of them, right? There's a lot of assumptions that we could get into. But one thing that really continues to strike me is just the magnitude of the need, right? The sheer number of people who are displaced today is so much greater than it was in the mid-1990s when the humanitarian industry or sector or oligopoly, if you will, was first getting started, kind of in its modern form, not just in sheer numbers, but proportionally, right? So, you know, the the global population has increased over the last 2 decades, but not nearly to the extent that the number of people who are displaced has increased. So I want to ask a question to the panelists, which is, why is that? What's been going on over the last 2 decades? And what does that mean for the humanitarian industry? What does that mean in terms of some of the assumptions? And I'll give you perhaps a hint of one of my own thoughts on this. And that is, you know, Jessica, you published a great article on sort of the numbers of humanitarian aid last September. And one of the numbers that really struck me there was the number of aid workers who have been killed in the line of duty, contrasting between the mid-1990s and I think it was 2019 or so. 500 people, 500 aid workers were killed in 2019 or 2020 or so, in comparison to a much smaller number in the mid-1990s. And so that in and of itself speaks to some sort of really fundamentally different dynamic at play today than 25 years ago. So maybe, Jessica, let me start with you to get your thoughts on what's different sort of fundamentally in today's humanitarian world in terms of scale and specific problem set versus 25 years ago.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Well, just in terms of the expansion of need and also the requirements, I mean, last year or this year, there's $36 billion being requested. And that's the requirement of humanitarian assistance. That's, you know, the largest requirement ever. It's now 38% funded today. But I do want to say that, you know, it has always been this funding gap, a consistent funding gap of around 35% throughout, you know, history, which begs the question of, you know, is what humanitarians are asking for, is that an accurate number, or is there this sort of game that's played with humanitarians and donors where, you know, they claim that, you know, needs are X and this is how much it will cost to respond, knowing that there will be about a 30% shortfall. But yes, aid is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are many more humanitarian aid workers out there. It once was this small collection of loosely organized groups, and it has seen, you know, staggering expansion. And it's become more competitive as well, you know, because there is so much money being poured into it. Now, does that mean that, you know, does bigger necessarily mean better? Not necessarily. I mean, I think we're more professionalized, we're more bureaucratized, but I think we've also lost some of the nimbleness, and it's grown to be this heavy, expensive, and sort of inflexible machinery that oftentimes is very slow and inefficient. But I will say that, you know, I think we're facing a global recession, you know, and what I think people are wondering what that will mean for the future of humanitarianism. It'll force new efficiencies in delivery models, you know, as donor states retreat to nationalism and are under more and more pressure to meet needs within their own states. We're going to see a hit to overseas assistance. We already saw the UK cut overseas development assistance last year. And for the first time last year, the amount of funding that went to humanitarian assistance actually decreased. And so what, will that mean actually? Will it mean that, smaller organizations won't be able to sustain? Will it mean there'll be some kind of consolidation or merging of organization? Will it mean that we'll get more funding from private sector? Will it mean a more realistic assessment of needs and priorities? Or will it also mean that we get rid of some of the bloat? I mean, Asher used that word, and will it force us to really prioritize the essentials of humanitarianism? I mean, we've kind of like expanded to development assistance, look, in doing work around disaster risk reduction, or even, some humanitarian core work like education. Will we sort of go back to a more contained response? And just to go to your point about the security threats, I mean, I think, yes, there have been more incidents, but there are, many more aid workers running around in the world. So yes, it's become riskier, but that's also because there are more of us out there. But what you didn't mention in that number, though, is that, the overwhelming majority of those casualties are national staff, or are people from those countries. Few are internationals. And I think that's really the important point there. That, over time, the international sector in insecure environments has, relied on bunkerization, really having their local counterparts shoulder or the burden of risk and putting them in harm's way, as opposed to, while international organizations stay in capital cities or work even remotely outside of the country. And so I think, when we talk about locally led aid, it's also important to keep in mind what, the burden of risk too that we're putting on those national actors as well. So I will pause there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. That's great. So I can't resist a segue that you provided in your comments to one of the questions we received, but it's also something that Asher, you and Jessica both touched on. And that is sort of the line or the balance between development aid and humanitarian aid. We've got a question here that says, where should that line be drawn between humanitarian aid and development assistance? Can the humanitarian aid and development assistance experts cooperate more effectively? Both of you touched on that. I think, Bill, you have got some thoughts on this as well. One of my questions would be, okay, so humanitarian aid has been increasing significantly over the last 2 decades, quadrupling in terms of constant dollars. Has the same been happening with development aid? Are we still are we resourcing the long-term sustainability, the resilience of these societies to the same extent as we are trying to patch up the short-term crises, or is there indeed an imbalance? So let me turn it over to you all to respond to this question. Maybe Asher, let's start with you, given your on-the-ground perspective in Yemen, and you mentioned this as well in terms of the long-term sustainability. And from there, we can open it up to the other panelists as well.
Sure, I'll say just a brief word on that, and also just respond to what Jessica had mentioned earlier. So development aid has a long history in Yemen in particular, but more broadly in the Middle East, where there are Gulf nations, not necessarily US aid or any of the European countries giving development aid, but it's development aid coming from the Gulf countries and then being given to Yemen. And that often comes with a lot of strings attached, strings that are very different from the Washington Consensus kinds of strings, but certainly ones that have equal amounts of risk in terms of political corruption related to that disbursement. And where that development aid stops and humanitarian aid begins is a very fungible term, and the definitions for which change year by year and for each donor. And yes, a well-thought development aid strategy can potentially avert many of the needs for humanitarian aid in emergency crises. Because if you actually have in Yemen, if you actually had the investment in infrastructure and internally development infrastructure, then you would not have the same humanitarian crisis where 3/4 of the population is on the verge of starvation. This was Arabia Felix. It was supposed to be the agricultural hub of the Arabian Peninsula. It should not be running out of food. Just on Jessica's point and with Hal's original question, so the UNHCR comes out with stats saying that the number of displaced refugees is increasing exponentially over a 20-year period or 30-year period. That's not surprising, because if the UNHCR came out and said that actually the number of those forced out of their home has decreased significantly, then the response will be they will all lose their jobs and UNHCR's budget will be cut. So there's a self-interested motivation, not just on UNHCR, I'm not calling them out in particular, but in a lot of these crisis modes that no positive stats or statistics, they won't have a very positive impact on this growing industry, as Bill called it. But in fact, the more you can trump up or create a far more significant crisis, the more money potentially that can flow in, and the more operations you can have. So if the budget, as Jessica said, is cut over the next 10 years, will the number of refugees also drop? Meaning, is there a correlation there between the money available and then the numbers that are being put together? That's just my skeptic.
And Hal, I'll answer one of your questions quickly, which is, has development assistance kept up with the pace of growth of humanitarian assistance over the last couple of decades? The answer is no. You look at statistics from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, between 2002 and 2019, development assistance from all donors went up 60%. Humanitarian assistance went up 400%. The International Disaster Assistance Account for USAID, which doesn't even account for what happens at the State Department, not even talking about the food aid budget, is the largest single line item appropriation for USAID. And humanitarian assistance as a sector for the agency, if it were not for PEPFAR, which is appropriated through the State Department, would be the largest part of the budget, exceeding global health. So there is the danger, as Mark Green used to say, that the humanitarian assistance accounts could swallow the rest of the agency. Their growth pattern has been such that they are vastly outpacing the growth of other assistance.
And can I just jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead, Jessica, please.
To just very briefly, I mean, just to say that, yes, there have been many iterations of trying to get humanitarian assistance and development assistance more aligned. There's been terms that have evolved over time, linking relief to development. We've recently called it the humanitarian development peacebuilding nexus. Now it's the humanitarian development collaboration. And I think the concept is really about, these short-term cyclical responses. Oftentimes humanitarians may come in immediately after a crisis, but they stay for a long time. And that's because there isn't development assistance to really meet the needs of vulnerable people. And so humanitarians are really left holding the bag when it comes to providing life-saving support, that if there was more investment in development, that could be avoided. And so these initiatives every couple of years to ensure linkages is really to say, this is ludicrous. We can't just keep coming back in after every crisis, and there needs to be sort of these joint outcomes that we both plan for together. So if we are in a food insecure environment, well, the humanitarians are going to provide for the acute, malnutrition, but there is a longer term goal that development actors are trying to address that, meet the needs of some of the systemic issues about food insecurity, so that humanitarians don't have to be on this constant treadmill of trying to provide support in a context that really needs longer term development investment.
Okay, thank you all three of you. So let me turn to another question, which is perhaps somewhat related, or perhaps offers something of an answer potentially to this sort of resource question that we've been wrestling with: development aid, long-term sustainability versus the short-term crisis of today. The question is about the private sector. What is the role and what should be the role of the private sector in humanitarian assistance efforts? How might the private sector partners be better involved in government and NGO efforts? And so to broaden the question a little bit here, is there a broader role here for the private sector to meet some of the needs we're seeing out there? And could that potentially help respond to this dynamic we have where, as Jessica was just describing, you sort of have this increasing need, and we're just trying to get all the resources there to meet that need without having any money left to address the underlying issues. So let me just hand it over to the panel, whoever would like to start on that one. Nobody has anything to say about the private sector. It's got no role, no role.
I can jump in. I mean, no, I do. They do have an increasing role, and they are more and more involved in humanitarian assistance, and they have been. I mean, I think the question is really, does the formal humanitarian system recognize them as, as humanitarians? But I remember I was doing an assessment in Tacloban in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, and we were asking people what they considered to be the most effective aid, and it wasn't the Cash for Work program that some agency did. It wasn't the small grant that we gave people the formal humanitarian sector gave to rebuild roofs. It was that Coca-Cola, which was the factory that was there, kept people on their payrolls for 3 months, even though their warehouse was flooded and people couldn't go to work. And we don't consider that humanitarian assistance, but to people who are affected, that made all the difference in their livelihoods and being able to meet their needs. There had been the evil private sector, that sort of false narrative about them wanting to make a profit, but we're this self-righteous international humanitarian sector is somewhat better than them. But when it comes down to it, and you ask people, a woman in Tacloban who's lost everything, do you care whether it's Coke who provides you, the food that you need, or WFP? She's just going to say who provides it faster and more efficiently and can do it to meet, what my needs are. And so I think, yes, there is a role for the private sector. We often don't recognize them as such. They do provide a significant part of the funding to the, international NGOs and UN organizations, but absolutely there's a role for them, and they meet needs that are sort of outside of our very narrow focus of what humanitarian assistance should look like. I mean, one other quick example is I remember during the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone. I mean, it was the mining companies who were able to help WHO to what the supply chain would look like, because they had been working in these places for years before, and they were setting up ways to test and take the temperature of their staff members so that there wasn't going to be an Ebola outbreak. Again, we don't consider this really as public health support, but I mean, these were really important steps that they were taking just to protect their profits, but in the end it had a very important consequence for these humanitarian crises. So I think it's really about expanding what we conceive of as humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, Hal, to build on that for 1 second, to answer what I think is embedded in your question, which is, will private resources or can private resources replace public sector donors and make up the difference? The answer is no, right? As funders, the private sector is never going to match the amount of money that public donors will give in humanitarian situations. But that's asking the wrong question. The kinds of things that Jessica's talking about are what the private sector is best at doing. And one of the most important things to do after a disaster is actually to get the private markets working again. This is the kind of thing that she's talking about in the Philippines. I saw it on a visit to Mozambique, where what people really needed was for the companies that were buying their crops, which is that part of the country affected by a couple of cyclones, were mostly for export to India, to get up and running again to buy their next harvest, right? No one was going to win, no matter how much aid we put in there. No community was going to be stable in that part of the country until those private companies were back solvent again with infrastructure that was going to allow them to purchase and export the crops that everyone around that part of the country grew.
Thanks. Fascinating anecdotes, both from Mozambique and also Jessica, your examples from the Philippines and elsewhere. Really interesting. So let me ask sort of you could interpret this question in a couple different ways, but we have a question from the audience that wants to know about politics, both domestic and international, as it relates to humanitarian aid. And there are a few different ways you can interpret this. Whether it's the domestic conversation that we're having here in this country in terms of foreign aid in general, whether it's humanitarian aid or not. Or you can also, I think, interpret this in terms of getting at perhaps another one of Jessica's underlying assumptions she was describing, which is sort of this idea that humanitarian aid is meant to be impartial, neutral, etc. Because it seems to me that in a lot of the places where humanitarian aid is delivered today, including in Yemen, Asher, it is very difficult to remain impartial and neutral in a conflict zone. And so I feel like politics are a really important thing to talk about and to grapple with within this industry, whether it is domestic in the donor countries or international in the actual zones where humanitarians are doing the work. So maybe Asher, to you first, in terms of your thoughts on how this might relate in the Yemen context or more broadly.
I think the political aspect is certainly one that changes potentially with each administration as the focus changes. But in a war zone in particular, and whether it's Syria, Libya, Yemen, or even in Afghanistan coming up, the choice of who gets money and who gets what aid is something that can potentially risk the ire of every party. If you choose the wrong national partner, then you're risking the blowback from political groups, news agencies, and others. Right. So in Yemen in particular, you asked me about that case. I think that giving money, for instance, to the Houthi government while you're still recognizing the opposing government that's based out of Riyadh, that has its own political implications. And if you are giving them the money, but at the same time labeling them as a terrorist organization, I think that you've got a catch-22. If you pull money back, then there's always that risk that people will suffer and the humanitarian crisis will get worse. But if you support a group, then by definition, you're giving them recognition. So there's no clear answer to your question, Helen. I'm sure Bill and Jessica probably have better things to say.
Bill, and
I'll say a couple of quick things. We're naive to believe that there is not a political aspect to humanitarian assistance. In every situation, politics have to be considered. I think even after much resistance, USAID has recognized that there is no such thing as impartially delivered or completely impartially delivered foreign aid. There are choices to be made. And unfortunately, in some circumstances, it's probably the case that our aid is making situations worse and that there's a moral hazard to some of our humanitarian assistance because of the political aspects. The worst regimes are skillful at manipulating humanitarian assistance in their favor, either for their political benefit, their public relations benefit, or for their financial benefit. And there are other cases, I'll point to Bangladesh, where the politics of the situation are prolonging a crisis which should really now be dealt with by the development professionals, right? We should all be recognizing and helping the government and people of Bangladesh recognize that the Rohingya are not going home. They have to be included now in the national development plans of Bangladesh, which are in large part funded by donors on the other side of the ledger. But the politics right now of both our interaction with Bangladesh and other major donors and the geopolitics of the Bangladeshi relationships with their neighbors make that a very difficult conversation. But every humanitarian situation is political.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, we talked about the politics, but just the impartiality question, which means that we're giving aid based on need alone, and there's no discrimination by nationality, race, religious belief, etc. But on the ground, humanitarians making those decisions about what needs are and whose needs are we talking about. Those are really ethically charged questions. And, we've very much improved how we go about assessing need and where we direct our resources to based on those assessments. But, it's not, there are constantly competing humanitarian needs, and we're constantly in a state of triaging which are worse, which are are those decisions made by, people who are affected. And it goes back to this broader accountability question. Are we engaging enough with people who are affected to really understand what their needs are? Or are we making those determinations based on what we have best to deliver? And how can we say we're impartially delivering if we're not doing it based on the former?
Let me ask a follow-up question to you, Jessica, on this. And we're about 10 minutes off from the end time now. So sort of short answers will be good. We still have a few questions to go here, but I want to follow up on something you just said there in terms of assessing needs, but also going back to another one of your assumptions, that being the definition of vulnerability, right? One of the things that I saw when I was at USAID was in responding to the ISIS genocide in northern Iraq against religious minorities there, there was a real sort of a challenge to kind of square the circle of these impartial assessment of needs with communities that had been targeted for extermination explicitly. And if the two didn't line up, then the humanitarian aid didn't necessarily go to those communities that had been targeted for extermination. If the assessment of needs showed that they actually weren't that bad off, where they are right now. And so my question to you, Jessica, is if you can just speak a little bit to the current conversation around vulnerability or changing sort of the methodologies around trying to figure out who gets the assistance and when.
Sure. I mean, I think, it's what you were talking about, and I've seen this as well, where we go in and we do an assessment and it doesn't match what we have funding to deliver. And then you say, oh, well, I guess we have to go back to the community and say that, we're going to deliver X and not Y, even though you asked for Y. And, and this goes back to aid really being this very supply driven model. And it's kind of a take it or leave it relationship with the people who are on the receiving end. And we have gotten better, I think, at understanding needs, at information sharing, but, these are all technical ways of approaching these very, human problems. And, they have to fit in a certain mindset and box. And so, yes, it's improved, but our sector, the humanitarian sector, is still very siloed in how it delivers humanitarian assistance. So we have, these defined clusters or silos of, food, wash, shelter, when in reality, a human being needs a combination of all of those things. And one way that, we've tried to, one way that everyone has sort of broken down those artificial silos is the increase in the use of cash in humanitarian assistance. And to say, let's put the needs or how people are going to respond to their own needs into the hands of people affected who know best what they need and want. Why do we go through these lengthy processes of determining need when, if I'm a family member affected and I need to buy medicine for my father or put my child in school, I can make that determination as opposed to these, artificial determination of what the priority needs are, which may not fit, what my reality looks like. So I think that's one way that the sector is recognizing that we have to give more power to people to make their own decisions and determine how they are going to get themselves out of these crisis situations.
Great, thank you. Now, I have to ask the question, we can't end the panel without me asking about Afghanistan, right? Asher, you mentioned this very sort of peripherally in one of your earlier comments, but this is potentially a huge humanitarian crisis coming at us. The Afghan economy up until earlier this year was hugely dependent on foreign aid. Up to 40% of the GDP was generated by foreign aid, in fact. Almost half the population is in poverty or food insecure. And now the Taliban are in charge and the foreign aid has been largely suspended. There was a UN conference last month in which $1 billion was pledged to aid those in need in Afghanistan. But given the context of everything we've been talking about here and all the challenges, I'm hoping some of you might be able to comment on what some of the real problems or issues may be coming at us when the international aid industry, as it were, sort of gins up to really get into Afghanistan to help what could potentially be a really spiraling situation there. Bill, maybe I'll come to you first, and then Asher, I'm interested in your thoughts as Jessica, anyone who wants to comment on this. Bill?
Yeah, Hal, the humanitarian need or potential need in Afghanistan is undeniable, but I hope that the US government and all of the other donors are thinking through very carefully how to avoid some of the pitfalls that we saw in Yemen that Asher's very accurately described in his article and his research. The potential for theft, for diversion, for funding terrorism is extraordinarily high in Afghanistan. And the urge to meet needs at no matter cost needs to be tempered with the recognition that safeguards like vetting and thorough guardrails need to be put in place that would restrict the Taliban from profiting from any assistance.
And I'll jump off that point to something that Bill and Jessica have been saying as well, this idea of localization, that Afghanistan was one situation where there would have been many potential partners. This is 1 year ago. You would have had no shortage of civil society organizations and partners and experts in Afghanistan, many of them trained by US officials or trained in the United States returning to Afghanistan. Many of them have left, and you can just tune to news media and you see the number of experts have left. So the partners leave the country, and all of your best laid plans have essentially fallen apart. And all you're left with was what Bill is saying. You need to now vet new partners because you tried to plan and tried to put it together, but it all fell apart overnight. So how do you then pick up the pieces and see which partners are still willing to work with you? And what happens if someone accepts money from the US entity? Is that putting them at risk then if you're not a centralized government authority? So all of those factors need to be taken into account. But again, you can plan, but sometimes those plans fall apart, and Afghanistan is one of those situations.
Thanks, Asher. And with just a few last minutes to us, I'd like to just leave it open to any of the panelists for any final comments and thoughts, anything that we've touched on that needs to be emphasized or anything we haven't yet talked about. Let me go to you first, Jessica, and then we'll go back to Bill and then Asher. Jessica?
No, I mean, I think this has been really illuminating for me as well to hear the other perspectives. I think that, you know, what I first talked about in terms of change, and, you know, that there's been some, you know, slow change within the humanitarian sector. You know, I think in some of my work at TNH, you know, I think it's important to remember that, you know, change happens on a small scale, and we don't need to. One of the people that was interviewed said, you know, we don't need to wait for a complete overhaul of the system to see change, and to look for ways that there are small changes that are already happening. So local leaders stepping up and being more assertive and taking more leadership roles within the humanitarian response and amplifying those. So those kind of small scale changes are taking place, and I think it's still an exciting time to be looking at, you know, what the implications of the last 2 years will be on the humanitarian sector.
Thank you. Bill, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I hope we can take away the need for us to focus on something Jessica said, which is listening to the recipients more. That is at the heart of a lot of this. I will never forget a woman in Ethiopia who was at a feeding station, food distribution station run by the World Food Program, who approached us and said, "Thanks for this bag of food, but what I really want from you is to help me never have to come back here and ask you for a bag of food again." We need to put the recipients and beneficiaries at the center and listen to what they have to say to us.
Thank you. Asher, last thoughts?
Yeah, and it's back to our theme that we started off with, localization. Is that especially now, as Jessica, Bill pointed out, that there's a potential for a decrease in the amount of humanitarian aid budget that will force these agencies to look local because they'll be cheaper and more efficient, and that localization may actually be the solution that we've all been looking for and we've been talking about.
Fantastic. Thank you, Asher. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for joining. This is a great panel, very engaging, very interesting. Thanks to the audience for sending in some really great questions. And of course, thanks to Wilson Center for hosting. So everyone enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And yes, thank you everyone for participating. Goodbye.